Hello, EDU 410. This is Jared, and I am excited to begin the first module of our sort of online transition here in the foundations of middle school. And today's lesson is going to be centered around adult advocacy and advisory programs in the middle school classroom. And so what I would like you to do before we really dig into the class material today is to go over to the right-hand side of the Module 1 tab on MyUSF, and I'd like you to download the article Welcoming Students with a Smile. Take 5 minutes or so, pause the video if you need to read through that article if you would. And as you're reading through it, I'd like you to annotate or to at least think through any questions that arise as you're reading the article, any important passages or important information that you recognize, or any ideas that you would like to try in your future classroom. The article itself should look something like this, and like I said, you're able to download it over on the side, or you can pause the video so that you're able to read it on the screen right now. So go ahead and continue reading that. Pause the video if you need to, and then go ahead and resume as soon as you have finished reading through the article. One quote from our textbook mentions that rather than address disruptive behavior as it happens, proactive techniques reduce the occurrence of such behavior as teachers and students build a positive classroom culture together. You know, this idea of proactive behavior management is very powerful. I believed for many years, even before reading this text, that by developing relationships with my students and by facilitating positive interactions with them, that I would thereby limit the number of negative behaviors and interactions that I would have to deal with that would manifest themselves later on throughout the course. We see proactive techniques in all fields. There was a billboard that was up, I think it was either on 41st Street or on Minnesota Avenue, and it was for one of the hospitals. I think it was for Sanford, and it said preventative medicine, the best form, or 100% success rate, or something like that. And the idea being that, you know, the best medicine is preventative medicine. Rather than waiting until you contract some sort of ailment, why don't you try to prevent that beforehand? We're even thinking and witnessing some of this with the COVID-19 outbreak and this idea of quarantine. Why would we quarantine perfectly healthy people and not allow them to go out into the community? Well, because what we're trying to do is prevent the spread of this virus into vulnerable populations. And so if you just take that idea of preventative medicine and think about what that might look like in your future middle school classroom, it's a powerful concept. Another quote that jumps out at me is, meeting students' emotional needs is just as important as meeting their academic needs. Now, this is a theme that's not new to this particular course, or if you've had other courses with me, this is not a theme that's new to the way that I teach. I do think that the first and foremost of importance when you're dealing with students is recognizing their emotional and mental health state, because if they're not in a position to learn, if they're not feeling comfortable and safe and in good hands, then it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how great of a lesson you plan. The learning is going to be limited because of their emotional needs that are not being met. The article notes that despite overwhelming evidence that such strategies are ineffective, many teachers rely on reactive methods for classroom behavior management rather than the proactive techniques that we're discussing here today. I'm sure if you think back to your own K-12 experience, there's a teacher that comes to mind, unfortunately, that was a reactionary teacher. Maybe you know people in your lives that are reactionary people. They don't really set any boundaries, and then when something blows up or some type of emergency situation arises, they're very reactive in their thinking. There are teachers that operate this way as well. And so they just raise their voice louder and louder and louder as students' misbehavior increases and increases and increases. But the problem there is that those strategies have been proven time and time again to be less effective or even ineffective in curbing student classroom management disruptions. And so my encouragement to you as we sort of begin this lesson today is to think about ways as you move into practicums, as you move into student teaching, as you move into your first professional job as a K-12 teacher, what are the proactive ways that you can sort of engender relationships and positive behaviors rather than resorting to the reactive methods as so many teachers do. On the top of your note sheet, what I'd like you to do is to once again go over to the right-hand column under the Module 1 tab, and I'd like you to download this worksheet. It's the Advocacy and Advisory Note Sheet. And what I'm going to ask you to do is that throughout our lesson today, you would fill in the information that's required. I do apologize for these fill in the blanks because they're going to be a little out of sorts. They might not be underlined, but do the best that you can. And this measures your engagement throughout the lesson. What I'll ask you to do once we have finished with Module 1 today is to save this note sheet and then upload it under coursework under the coursework tab of My USF for EDU 410. So I'd like you to go ahead and to pull this out, and I'd like you to begin with this first question up here. I'm just kind of asking you a basic question, and what I'd like you to do is to consider a challenging transition that you faced at some point during your K-12 years. That's a transition maybe from one building to another. Maybe you moved houses, maybe you changed schools, maybe you changed classes. Something that sticks out in your mind several years later now. And what I'd like you to do is to describe the situation, describe the grade or the age that you were, and what role, if any, adults played in your life during this time period. Go ahead and pause the video if you need to in order to complete this reflection, and then hit resume when you're ready to continue. You know that I always like to share my personal stories with you. And so really quickly, I'd like to share my transitional challenge story. And the toughest challenge for me was moving from the elementary school to middle school. I grew up in a neighborhood where we had an elementary school not far from our house. All the neighborhood kids went to that same school. And living in Sioux Falls, the nature of our city and the way that our neighborhoods were divided, when I moved into middle school, I had to attend a school that was several miles away from my house. So it was impossible for me to ride my bike or to walk to middle school. Instead, I had to take a bus. This is the first time that I was ever required to take a bus in my entire life. And not only that, the nature of middle school was a challenge because I went from sort of being the top dog as a fifth grader, knowing all of my teachers, knowing all of the kids in the school, to now being the lowest rung on the ladder as a sixth grader in a middle school, where I didn't know anybody. I had to move to a different class every 50 minutes. I had to ride the bus, and it was confusing. And it was a very difficult transition for me. The one saving grace throughout this time is that I had begun playing music in fifth grade. I started with a trumpet, and then I migrated to saxophone and later to guitar and bass and all kinds of instruments. Music is still an important part of my life, but the one saving grace that I had as I transitioned to middle school was that my elementary band teacher was also the same band teacher that I had in middle school. And so there was this one minor connection between fifth grade and sixth grade. There was this one person who knew me before I had come to the middle school. And it was those, a couple times a week, I would go to band class, and it was those types of experiences where I learned just as much about being a middle schooler and transitioning into the middle school setting as I did, how to actually play my saxophone, that I remember that relationship, and I remember that connection that I had and the advocacy that that teacher displayed for me. And that was a very powerful and shaping event in my young academic career. Well, today our goal and our objective is to talk a little bit about what it means to be an adult advocate, what we mean by the term advocacy in a middle school setting, and then also to experience what an advisory program is, and to begin thinking about how advisory programs and curriculum might be incorporated into our middle school setting. So our objective is to define and defend both the purpose and the procedures for implementing advisory programs and adult advocacy in the middle school setting. So you've got your note sheet out. I'm going to go ahead and get into the direct instruction portion of today's lesson, and I invite you to follow along with me. Our first question then is, what is advocacy, or what do we mean by the term advocacy in a middle school setting? Second, what do we mean when we talk about advisory? You've heard about an advisor, maybe you have an idea of what advising might be, but what do we mean by these two terms in the middle school classroom? Well, the text defines advocacy as an operational mindset, an attitude about how we engage with and support young adolescents during these important years of growth. So pause the video if you need to write that down, but what's important for us to recognize is that advocacy is not necessarily a program. It's not necessarily a title that somebody has in the school. Oh, I'm the advocate for such and such students. But advocacy is more of a mindset. It's a way we go about business. It's an attitude. It's a worldview that we use and that we engage in order to support the students that we're in contact with. Advisory is a little bit different, because an advisory program in the middle school setting is a specifically designed program that's used by middle-level educators to address the unique needs and interests of adolescent learners. And we've talked throughout the early part of this course about the unique nature of 10 to 15-year-old students. And advisory programs are those programs that are designed with the specific needs and interests of that age group in mind. Now, the text is going to state from the Association of Middle-Level Educators that every middle-level educator needs to be an advocate for young adolescents. You're not going to get a title on your teaching certificate that says, oh, you're an advocate. But it's, again, it's a mental framework. It's an attitude. It's an approach that we take. But an adult advocate is characterized by three particular traits. The first is that adult advocates are knowledgeable about young adolescent development. We've talked through some of these unique changes and challenges facing young adolescents as they integrate themselves into the middle school setting. Adult advocates are knowledgeable about those developmental traits. Additionally, adult advocates enjoy working with young adolescents. They're not the sorts of teachers that are like, well, you know, teaching would be great if it weren't for the kids. All right. I encourage everybody who teaches middle-level education to intentionally make that decision, because the needs are unique and very different from what you experience in an elementary classroom or even what you experience in a high school classroom. So if you don't enjoy working with this age band of 10 to 15-year-olds, then you're probably not fit to be a young adolescent adult advocate. And then finally, an adult advocate takes the time and effort required to get to know students as individuals. We talk about this all the time, that we cannot stereotype, we cannot generalize the experiences of our students, but we need to recognize that every one of those 25 desks in our classroom are occupied by individual people, individual human beings. Keep in mind that advocacy is an operational mindset and an attitude about how we engage with and support YAs during the middle school years. I had to share this quote with you. I know I'm breaking all the rules of PowerPoint by putting this large of a quotation up here, but just sit for a minute and listen to me as I read this quotation because I think it's powerful. As young adolescents undergo the many changes that occur in this transition stage of life, they need the support and guidance of adults who understand them and can put into perspective their occasionally belligerent ways, their often silly manner, their sometimes hurtful nature, and their incessant questioning. Young adolescents want desperately to talk to adults. These young people are quite literally making up their minds about the values, attitudes, and dispositions that will direct their behavior in the years to come. How profound is that, folks? I love teaching at the college level. When I interact with you in our face-to-face environment, the conversations and discussions that we have are unparalleled because you have the intellectual capacity and you have the motivation to think about and engage with education in a way that none of my K-12 students are able to do. But when I think back to my years as a middle school teacher, this is profound and powerful. The fact that the students that you're engaging with are literally being shaped and formed. They're making up their minds about who they are going to become, what values will be important to them, what attitudes will shape their life, what dispositions and behaviors they will embrace. See, when I'm dealing with 20 and 21 and 22-year-olds and even the older graduate students, you've already cemented a lot of these mental habits and attitudinal mind frames already. And so I have very limited power over shifting and shaping those. I have some influence, but as a middle-level educator, you have a profound influence upon your students. And it's important to recognize that even though these students might appear as though the last thing that they want to do is have a conversation with you, they're really actually desperate for that adult interaction and conversation. So what is advisory then? Well, advisory is just one of many ways to encourage that interaction and that conversation. For students to interact not just with the adult advocates in their lives, but with other students as well. And so advisory programs are programs that are designed to address the needs and the interests of middle school kids. If you think back to your middle school experience, did you have some sort of advisory program? Did you have a homeroom type experience? We called it ad room when I was a kid, or pro time when I was in middle school. Some of the Sioux Falls students might recognize those labels. And what I want you to do is to think about the homeroom type experience you had, and I want you to gauge it. I want you to weigh how effective it was. And did it meet the criteria set forth by the AMLE in terms of what an actual middle-level advisory program is and is meant to do? The two purposes of advisory. First of all, they address the needs of young adolescents, and then they also support students' academic development. Now here's where many of the homeroom/study hall models that I see fall short. Because they might attempt to address number two, in that they're giving you time to support you academically, hey, get your homework done. But they're not specifically designed to address the needs and or the interests of the young adolescents in the classroom. So what are the attributes of an effective middle-level advisory program? Number one, advisory programs have a designated staff member who is responsible for a small group of students. That means every day or once a week, I meet with the same students. And what's beautiful is if we're able to keep that same group of students from 6th grade to 7th grade to 8th grade. There's one designated staff member who that student knows they can always go to, even if they're not in their class academically. They are an adult that's there to support the student. Number two, second attribute is regularly scheduled meetings of the advisory group. Okay, I've been in contexts where we have literally met every single day. I've been in other contexts where our meetings were multiple times a week. And then I've been in some where we've only met once a week. The point is that we are regularly carving out time in the school schedule to meet with our group of students. The third attribute is ongoing individual conferences between the advisor and the advisee throughout the school year. When I was teaching at Lincoln, we had a situation that was similar to this. It wasn't a middle school advisory, obviously. Lincoln's a high school, but one of the tasks that I had for my ad room was to every 2 weeks check in with them academically. I had very few of my advisory students in class. They had other English teachers or they weren't in my level of class, but I still checked in with them nonetheless to be one more adult voice encouraging them if I saw the grades dropping in any way. The fourth attribute is administrative support for advisory activities. If you do not have the support and backing of your administrators, your principals, your superintendents, then your advisory program is going to suffer. What does support look like? Well, it might be in the terms of finances. We're going to designate a certain sum of money to buy resources that are research-based that are going to help nurture the needs of our students. So it might be financially. It might be just in terms of time, like we discussed in point number 2, that the administrators are, as they're dealing with this puzzle that is the academic schedule, they're making it a priority to preserve this brief amount of time for you to meet with your students. The fifth attribute of advisory programs is ongoing parental contact with the school through the child's advisor. So I noted in point 3 that I had conferences regularly with my advisory students about their grades. I would also call and email, sometimes text, sometimes meet at parent-teacher conferences, the parents or the guardians of the students in my advisory. And this was powerful. And I found that it was more often than not very pleasant exchanges because I was never the teacher giving the bad grade. I was the teacher reporting the struggles of the student and trying to join forces with the parent to support the student. Because I had so few of these students actually in my academic class, when I had conversations with the parent, I didn't know all the specifics about the work. Okay, I didn't know the specifics about the student's behavior in the class. So I was able to focus on like real positive interventions that we could implement, ways that we could support the student and come together to do that. Number 6, attribute of an advisory program is an adult advocate for every single young adolescent in the school, regardless of gender, regardless of grade level, regardless of academic ability or special education designation or any other handicaps. Nothing should interfere with a student or limit them from being a part of an advisory group. And so we would welcome in students that were in wheelchairs, we would welcome in students from the autistic program, we would welcome in students that maybe were hearing impaired or visually impaired. Because none of those differences matter. The research says that every student benefits when they have an adult advocate. So why do we do this? How do we convince our administrators that this is important? Well, the research says that schools that have instituted advisory programs with fidelity, meaning they've met the criteria that we listed right here, see greater academic achievement within their students. They see fewer students who feel alienated because they have this core group of people and they're dedicated to these advisory experiences that build the collaboration, the communication, the team building. They have increased attendance in their student population. They recognize less vandalism within and throughout the school. They have more student-centered learning activities, a better or more positive educational climate. Another quote that I leave you with here is, often the predominant question teens have while they're trying to exist in the larger, more anonymous middle school is whether life is really worth living. We must find the ways and time to give them the personal attention and support they need to grow up as healthy people in both body and mind. Further evidence of the importance of advisory type programs. Middle school students are very impressionable. I mean, they're literally making up their minds about the value and the nature of life. I don't know if you can say it any better than my colleague, Professor Randy Nelson, has said it to his classes. He says that kids don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Relationships always precede academics. It doesn't mean that the academics are not important, but if you do not have that relationship and that connection in place, the academics will always suffer. One more time. What is advocacy? It's an operational mindset. It's an attitude about the ways that we can support students in the middle school setting. What is advisory? A specific program that's designed with the needs of middle school students in mind. And so now it's your turn. What I'm going to ask you to do right now is to go once again to the right-hand side of Module 1 and to download Advisory Activity Number 1. I'd like you to read through this lesson plan of sorts, and then I'd like you on your note sheet to summarize the 3 major components of this advisory lesson plan. The first is the way that the students greet each other. It's called the greeting. The way that they share with each other, it's just called the share time, and then the activity that the teacher initiates, which is called the activity. And then finally, I'd like you to reflect a little bit on the benefits and the drawbacks of using such an activity in your future middle school classroom. This is just one of many examples of what a research-based advisory program might look like. It would be a lesson plan. It would be teaching in the same way you teach your content, whether that's history or math or music or language arts. Only we're teaching relationships. We're teaching how to get along in community. We're teaching advisory. So go ahead, pause this video, read through that advisory activity, and then when you're ready, resume for our final closure component of today's lesson. I want you to end today by reflecting upon the advisory activity that you encountered and the ways in which it did or did not address the needs and interests of middle level learners. Once you have completed the note sheet, I encourage you to go to the coursework tab and to upload and submit today's note sheet so that I am able to give you credit for it. Thank you for your time and attention today. I will see you on Wednesday for module number 2, which is focused on the school environment.